concept of market efficiency is critical to understanding why markets work. Now, as economists, we need a very simple, measurable way to determine market efficiency. And we do it by saying that a market is more efficient if we can increase the combination of consumer surplus and producer surplus. So if there's a way that consumers can get more utility, producers can get more profits, and the combination of those two increases, then we have a more efficient market. Marshall came up with the idea of using the price system and the market to be able to achieve efficiency. So in other words, as the consumer strives to maximize their utility, and as the producer strives to maximize their profits, the efforts made by each party increases the efficiency of the market. And so we call that Marshallian efficiency. And so a Marshallian improvement would be one in which, through the market prices, we see an improvement in the size of the combination of profits and consumer surplus. But Vilfredo Pareto came along, and what Pareto said was, what if you could make at least one person better off and not make anybody else worse off? That would be an improvement in efficiency, and it wouldn't require the market to do it. So if we could just find a way to make one or a few people better off and not have any impact on anybody else, that would be good. And that's true. However, the only way we can really achieve that is if we have unallocated resources. So in other words, if we have resources that aren't being used by anybody, sure, we could make some people better off without making anybody worse off. That's a very difficult situation. Let's suppose that we take the example of my oldest and my youngest sons. We'll call them Gordy and Stu. They're both good young men. One's a CIO in Silicon Valley. The other one is a doctor. Of course, the one that's a doctor is married and has 3 children, so he has to be in better graces because, after all, he's brought me some grandchildren. I'm putting together my estate and trying to decide who's going to get what when I die. And so I could leave everything to Gordy. That would be optimal for Gordy and nothing for Stu. Or I could leave everything for Stu and nothing for Gordy, or some combination in between. Some of the things that I have would be of greater utility to Gordon, and others would be of greater utility to Stuart. So in an optimal world, we would have the allocation such so that the combination of their 2 utilities would be the maximum possible. However, what happens if I have a situation in which I've allocated 80% of my estate to Gordy and 20% to Stu? That may not be optimal. If I'm sitting on my possibility frontier at 80-20, I cannot have a Pareto improvement because there's no way that I can make Stu better off without making Gordy worse off. So it's impossible to have a Pareto improvement. The only way that I could have a Pareto improvement in this situation would be if I have some resources that I haven't allocated yet. In that case, I could allocate some of them to Gordy or some of them to Stu, and the other child wouldn't be any worse off. They wouldn't be any better off, but they wouldn't be any worse off. One of the best examples of this, to show the absurdity of the Pareto model, is to look at a situation in which you have slavery. Now, in a situation with slavery, you have a master and a slave. And what happens is, through force, the master makes the slave work harder than they would want to, keeps their resources, and has an unfair allocation. So the master has almost all the resources and all the benefits. The slave gets very little, except maybe food and some housing. Now, we all know this is a terrible thing. And yet, if we're sitting on the possibility frontier, there's no way using Pareto that we can eliminate slavery. And yet we know it's not efficient. So this creates a real problem for Pareto. And so 2 economists, Caldor and Hicks, suggested some people are worse off and some people are better off, but there is a net social improvement. Then we could move to the proper place on the curve. So this is called a Caldor-Hicks improvement. And of course, going back to our example of slavery, if we then freed the slave, the master would be worse off, the slave would be better off, but the net positive would be higher, and we would have freedom. And so you can see that Caldor-Hicks has its place. However, there are certain people in our society who are going to really take a liking to the Caldor-Hicks approach. If you haven't guessed already, it's politicians. This is an excuse for them to start transferring assets from one party to another, claiming that they're making a Caldor-Hicks improvement. In some cases they are, but in many cases they're not. I have a friend from many years ago who was a professional surfer. Now, you might guess that very few professional surfers make any money. There's a few that do, but most of them make virtually nothing. And so this friend, who was single, lived in a tent on the beach, pretty much never had anything to eat. And so he was always looking for some help. And so he went on government welfare. So he was getting a check from the government to sleep in a tent on the beach in California. And so at that very same time, I was the CEO of a tech company, making a pretty significant salary. However, I happened to have 4 of my 5 children in college at that time. And that meant room and board, automobile, tuition, and the expenses were very high. I watched as my bank balances and savings dwindled, hundreds of thousands of dollars leaving my accounts as I tried to educate my children. My income couldn't possibly have covered all of that. Nevertheless, the government taxed me at a 50% tax rate, took my money and gave it to the surfer on the beach. So the question is, who had the greater utility or need for that money? And how does the government know? As you can guess, none of us know. I would feel like I did. The surfer might feel like he did. This is where we get into trouble with Caldor Hicks. How do we decide where the greatest utility is? Because we can't just stick a utility monitor on people's forehead and say, okay, your gauge of utility for that money is X dollars, and this person is X minus 1, so you get the money. It's way more complex. So as you can see, the concept of utility and profits and efficiency can be very complex. Yet we need to solve this problem if we're going to maximize economic growth and achieve our goals.